we're going to be talking about slavery and the limits of democracy. And in particular, as I already kind of indicated, what we're going to be thinking about is not just slavery, but also the ways in which ideas of racism that helped to support and justify slavery sort of really challenged the core ideals of the American Revolution and the challenges that that created during the early Republic. So this first point is obviously one that I just made a moment ago, that I think it's really important that in order to kind of really understand the challenges that slavery and race posed during the early Republic, we actually have to talk about how these issues are being thought about and grappled with during the American Revolution itself. This is actually an image from, this is actually a very early colonial image. This is from when New York was still under Dutch control and was New Amsterdam. But I think that it really sort of gets to the heart of the challenge of what's happening in the colonial era and the ways in which slavery sort of poses this fundamental contradiction. You have a situation in which, in this case, Dutch, but also English and other European colonists are coming and settling in what eventually become the original 13 British colonies. But if you look towards the bottom of your screen, if you look towards the bottom of the image, what you see there is the ever-present, but largely unspoken reality, which is that the nation is being formed by and the labor of enslaved Africans. And that is the sort of fundamental contradiction that slavery presents and represents as the American Revolution begins to unfold. I think a lot of historians now would argue that if there was any sort of fundamental contradiction that that the reality of what's happening on the ground in the newly forming United States represented, it is the very fundamental existence of slavery itself, that in some ways slavery was the ultimate contradiction. This is actually, this image here is, many of you may have seen this before. This is a pretty widely circulated image you can find pretty easily on the internet with a simple Google search if any of you want to use it in your classes. But this is an image that is obviously advertising Africans for sale. And there's a couple of clues in here that indicate this is an advertisement that is particularly being pitched towards colonists in the Carolina colonies. If you notice here in the center of the image, they're saying these are Negroes that have just arrived from the Windward and the Rice coasts. And of course, during the colonial period, the Carolina colonies were primarily centered around rice cultivation. And they're particularly interested in buying Africans that are coming from rice growing regions of West Africa. And of course, they are eventually going to be sold here in Charlestown, which of course we now think of as Charleston, South Carolina. So here you have a situation in which slavery is really driving the economies of these colonies. And so when the American Revolution begins, the rebels, right, who are pushing for emancipation from English rule are having to then think about and grapple with the institution of slavery. And they're struggling with the sort of moral and political questions about slavery's legitimacy alongside the real economic reality surrounding the ways in which slavery really supports their livelihood, right, from an economic standpoint. This really becomes a significant crisis during the era of the American Revolution, because, and I'm going to talk through each one of these really briefly. The American Revolution, to a large degree, was inspired by kind of three central movements. And I know some of this will be familiar to you, but I'm hoping that we can kind of rethink some of these movements relative to the institution of slavery. So there's kind of three movements or three kind of ideological influences on the American Revolution, all of which bring up questions around the institution of slavery. The first, of course, is one that I imagine you talk with your students a lot about already, and that is, of course, the influence of the Enlightenment and the rise of what we now think of as natural rights philosophy. So we have people like John Locke, among others, who are starting to think about how the universe is organized, right? There's a sort of a scientific revolution. People like, Sir Isaac Newton and others are thinking about how the universe is governed by scientific principles. But then you also have intellectuals like John Locke, who are raising questions about how human society is governed. And this is where we begin to see the birth of natural rights philosophy, right? This idea that, like the universe, like gravity, right? What goes up must come down, in the same way that the earthly realm is governed by a set of sort of natural principles, that human beings are perhaps also governed by a set of natural laws. And of course, I always talk to my students about the fact that these are probably familiar concepts to most of us. One of the core principles of natural rights, of course, is that all human beings are endowed with a set of inherent natural rights. And we are all familiar with the language of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The problem is that natural rights philosophy also talked about a fundamental inherent natural right that we tend not to talk about as often because the language doesn't appear in the Declaration of Independence alongside life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the right to property, it was considered as fundamental of a natural right as the right to life and the right to liberty. And what I'm hoping is that you see already an internal contradiction here, right? That there is a contradiction between the right to liberty and the right to property when it comes to the institution of slavery. Because the question naturally arises then, what happens when a person is property? Do they have a right to their liberty? Or does the person who technically legally owns them have the right to hold them as property? So already built into natural rights philosophy is a fundamental contradiction relative to the institution of slavery that American rebels are not perhaps fully ready to completely reconcile. So from the outset, natural rights philosophy is both championing the idea that people have a right to freedom, but also the idea that people have the right to hold property. And there's not a real clear sense of what happens or how issues get resolved when people are property. Now, some of you probably talk about this in your classes, but of course, one of the things that's really interesting relative to the institution of slavery is that if you look at the language of a lot of the documents that are coming out of the newly forming United States, American rebels are very often using imagery and language about slavery. They are using the rhetoric of slavery to argue for their own emancipation, their own freedom from the English crown. So as they're battling to become independent states, they often refer to themselves as being enslaved by the English crown or being slaves to the English crown. And they're very actively using the ideas of slavery and the illegitimacy of slavery in their own battle for freedom. Now, it is important to point out that a few of the most famous of the American rebels actually recognized this contradiction. Some of you probably talk about Thomas Paine in your classes. He was the author of Common Sense, which was probably the most famous and the most widely circulated American authored document arguing in favor of the independence of the United States from English rule. Historians sometimes refer to Common Sense as kind of being the Bible or the primer of the American Revolution. And Thomas Paine was actually among the few rebels who sort of recognized the contradiction between slavery and the language of the American Revolution. And I've shared here a quote from him, essentially saying, you know, how is it that those of us who are arguing for freedom from the English crown can complain so loudly of attempts to enslave them while they hold so many hundreds of thousands in slavery? So there are some of these folks who are thinking not just about natural rights relative to themselves, but are also thinking about how natural rights philosophy violates the rights of enslaved people. The problem, though, is that people like Thomas Paine are relatively few and far between. And the vast majority of American rebels, as I alluded to a minute ago, were not necessarily ready to acknowledge that the existence of slavery exposes a fundamental contradiction between what they claim to be about and what's actually happening on the ground. So here we have the clashing, right, between the rhetoric of liberty and the inequality of slavery. And I think in some ways this image here, which is actually an image of Black soldiers fighting in the American Revolution, sort of epitomizes that challenge. Here you have Black soldiers who have volunteered to fight for the Americans during the American Revolution, based on the idea that American rebels actually believe in the idea of liberty for all, only to find out that eventually their commitment to slavery becomes more important than their commitment to liberty. So that's the first kind of influential movement, right, that is raising questions about slavery during the American Revolution, the Enlightenment and natural rights philosophy. The second, and again, this is something you probably talk about in your classes as well, is the Great Awakening, which later became referred to as the First Great Awakening, because of course there's a second Great Awakening that happens beginning in the 1820s. But in the 1740s, we see come into being what becomes known as the First Great Awakening. Many of you probably know that by the end of the 17th century, by the late 1690s, religious fervor in what is becoming the United States had gone into decline, really across the colonies, largely in response to the Salem witch trials, right? And some of the really sort of over the top response to religious sentiment. People were starting to back away from the church, feeling like, okay, we got a little out of control with the Salem witch trials. Perhaps, you know, religious enthusiasm is a little too strong in the colonies. And so there was actually a bit of a fall off relative to real strong religious sentiment. But about 50 years or so later, in the 1740s, there is a pretty significant religious revival that sweeps the colonies. And it's one that really explicitly emphasizes democracy. And what I mean by that is that it's a religious movement that is emphasizing the idea that you don't need a priest or a minister or some kind of an intermediary for you as an individual to communicate with God, that it's actually possible for individual people to directly communicate with God. That's a pretty radical idea in the 1740s. In contemporary society, people feel completely comfortable with the idea that you can pray directly to God, right? But in the 1740s, that's still a pretty radical idea. There still is a strong sense that you need an intermediary in order to be able to communicate with God. But so here's this sort of democratic movement that says, hey, everybody, right, can communicate spiritually. And so this is a pretty radical challenge of authority, right? It's saying we don't need a minister or a priest, right, to mediate our relationship with God, that everyone can have direct access. But the thing that's really radical about the Great Awakening is that they begin to promote an idea known as spiritual equality, which essentially says every human being is equal in the eyes of God. So I'm not sure if you'll have an opportunity to discuss this week relative to gender, but this is also something that's a pretty radical concept relative to women, right? Because spiritual equality is saying women are equal to men in the eyes of God, children are equal to adults in the eyes of God. But it also means that other people, right, other races, Native Americans, African Americans, right, that other folks who may not look like you are all equal in the eyes of God. So hopefully you can imagine the moral crisis this creates relative to slavery, that if everyone is equal in the eyes of God, then what right does a human being have to hold another human being in bondage, right? That if an enslaved person is equal to anyone else in the eyes of God, then how does a human being have the right to supersede, right, what God says? And so the Great Awakening really creates a challenge in the minds of people, both in the North and the South, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, relative to whether or not it's morally acceptable for slavery to continue. So here you have this kind of interesting process, right? You have sort of a philosophical, intellectual challenge to the legitimacy of slavery through natural rights philosophy. You have a moral and religious challenge to the legitimacy of slavery through the Great Awakening. And then you also have a political challenge to the legitimacy of slavery in the form of a political philosophy known as republicanism. And I know most of you know this, but here we are talking about republicanism with a little r, right? Republicanism as a political philosophy, not the big R, Republican Party, right? But so the political philosophy of republicanism is really based on three central ideas. The first, of course, is that liberty is an individual's greatest right. So republicanism as a political philosophy is looking at natural rights philosophy and saying, okay, everyone has a fundamental right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, but not all of these natural rights are created equal. And liberty is actually the most important of those rights. The second sort of principle behind republicanism is that a strong government is a threat to liberty. And so the power of government should be limited. And of course, we see this play out in later years relative to the Civil War, right? Does the federal government, does most of the power rest in the hands of the federal government? Or do states actually have the right to determine what is going to happen in their territory? Republicanism as a political philosophy would say the federal government, right, should not have as much power. And the third of these is that people have the right to reject or overthrow the government if it abuses its powers. And of course, you see that language in the Declaration of Independence, right? When there has been a long train of abuses, right? People have not just the right, but have the responsibility to overthrow an abusive government. Now, hopefully what you can see here is that the first and the third of these ideas have pretty significant consequences for slavery, because the core to the idea of republicanism would be that, yes, a slaveholder has a right to property, but liberty is the most important of the rights that human beings have. And so that should become more important, right? The right of an enslaved person to their liberty should technically, according to republicanism, be more important, right, than the right of a slaveholder to hold a human being in bondage. Now, the third one also has consequences for slavery, because it's essentially saying if the government abuses its power, if the government does not protect the rights of enslaved people to liberty, then those people and the people who support their right to liberty should technically have the right to overthrow the government, right, in order to reinstate their liberty. So both the first and the third of those principles become really important in terms of challenging slavery as an institution. The problem is that the second principle ultimately becomes used to support slavery, because as I alluded to earlier, the Southern states eventually say, look, as individual states, we have the right to determine what happens within the boundaries of our territory, and the federal government should not have the right to abolish slavery unless we decide that's what we want to happen. So the point here is that at the core of sort of the ideology of the American Revolution is a fundamental contradiction relative to the institution of slavery. And it raises a series of fundamental questions, as you can see here, about the legitimacy of slavery from an ideological and a moral and a political perspective. But it also brings to light this problem that I raised a little bit earlier, which is which becomes more important. If a human being is property, then which right do we value over the other? Do we value a person's right to liberty, or do we value a person's right to property? And that's the fundamental core contradiction that slavery presents during the era of the American Revolution. What this reveals over time is that the American Revolution, the ideology, the rhetoric, the language of the American Revolution is based on really beautiful, inspiring core ideals, right? Freedom, liberty, brotherhood, justice for all. But in reality, on a practical level, the folks who are espousing these ideas, with a few exceptions like Thomas Paine, right? The vast majority of these folks do not intend for or have a plan for applying these ideals to the Black population. And as I'm sure you're talking about this week, to other populations like women and Native Americans as well. What ultimately happens relative to the Black population is that slavery radically expands, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment, that as white colonists are issuing these really dramatic and beautifully crafted appeals for their own freedom, right, from English, what they're describing as English tyranny, right, the tyranny of being controlled by this outside government, they are at the same time continuing to uphold the oppression and the enslavement of their property, right, their human property. So I want to talk just quickly, and this is something we'll have an opportunity to talk more about in the breakout sessions, but I want to talk just quickly about how this plays out relative to the founding documents and some of the challenges that slavery presents relative to the founding documents. Of course, again, I realize that you probably talk quite a bit in your classes about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But again, I want to sort of take these like familiar documents and have us think about them and problematize them a bit relative to the institution of slavery. Because what we see is that this sort of confusion and ambivalence that the founding fathers have about slavery and about whether or not Black people have the same rights as white colonists begins to play out as they are shaping both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So one of the documents that I have circulated for us to talk about during the breakout sessions is actually a section from the original draft of the Declaration of Independence that was later stricken from the Declaration before it was approved. But it's a really interesting, I think, reflection on how the rebels are trying to think about slavery relative to their own battle for freedom. So for those of you who have had a chance to look at it, you know that the statement essentially is a section that attacks the King of England and the English crown more generally for its role in perpetuating the slave trade, but also perpetuating slavery in the new colonies itself. And again, we'll have a chance to, in the breakout sessions, to dig a bit more deeply into this document. But this is an excerpt from the original draft of the Declaration of Independence that, interestingly enough, was written by Thomas Jefferson, who I imagine most of you know was a pretty significant slaveholder. But he wrote this when describing the frustration that colonists had with the King of England. So he here, of course, refers to the King of England. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people. And here, of course, they're talking about Africans who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. So he's describing here, he's essentially saying slavery is a violation of human nature itself, and it violates the most sacred rights of life and liberty. And that the King of England and the English crown more generally is guilty, right, of either killing people in the process of being transported from Africa to the Americas, or enslaving them, right, once they arrive in the Americas. Again, what's fascinating about this, and I'm hoping that this is one of the things we'll have a chance to talk about in the breakout sessions, is that Thomas Jefferson wrote this section as a slaveholder himself. And so we need to kind of unpack, right, what it means that slaveholders are attacking the King of England for establishing and perpetuating slavery itself. The point here is that obviously that language never made it into the final version. For those of you who have read the Declaration of Independence, you know that section is not in there. So that tells us a lot, right, about what the founding fathers, what the delegates, right, to the Second Constitutional Convention are, they're struggling with. The reality is that they are aware of the fact that their economy, both in the North and in the South, is heavily dependent on either or the slave trade and slavery itself. And the delegates who are attending these conventions are not willing, right, to kind of make a unilateral attack on the institution of slavery. Now, again, what's significant about this, and I've referenced Thomas Jefferson, but he's not alone in this regard. Historians still sort of debate who exactly among the signers of the Declaration of Independence were actually slaveholders. But there is agreement that somewhere between a third to a half of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. So again, that tells us a lot, right, about the challenges that they are grappling with in their own minds. They have natural rights philosophy. They have the ideas of the Great Awakening. They have their ideas about republicanism and their commitment to liberty, but they also have the fundamental reality of their economic lives. What they ultimately obviously decide to do is to remove this passage that they all sort of declare as offensive to the reality of their economic livelihoods. And they just decide not to comment about slavery at all in the Declaration of Independence. What that means is that in making that choice to remove that passage, they are sidestepping, right, the reality of the contradiction that slavery presents. And they're ultimately trying to grapple with how to navigate that going forward. The same problem happens relative to the Constitution. This is an issue, I imagine, because most of you teach about the Constitution and the 3/5 compromise, that you're probably well familiar with it. But I just want to kind of revisit it quickly to, again, sort of highlight the ways in which the drafting of these early documents raises real challenges relative to the institution of slavery. Obviously, one of the key issues that delegates are debating about when they are drafting the Constitution is about congressional representation. And I'm sure you talk about this a lot in your classes because, of course, that's what determines the branches of government and the Senate versus the House of Representatives and all of that, right? And for that debate, that's really centered around a question of large states versus small states, right? Both in terms of territory, large and small, but also in terms of population. And to a large degree, that discussion was framed around large versus small. But it is important to acknowledge that that also, to some degree, also fell along regional lines. You certainly have smaller states with smaller populations in the north, places like New Hampshire or Vermont. But for the most part, the less populous states in terms of white colonists are in the southern region. And so the slaveholding states, particularly the southern slaveholding states, really wanted slaves to be able to be counted as people, right, when determining the number of representatives. This was particularly important in places like North and South Carolina, where the white population is dramatically outnumbered by the enslaved population. And so representatives in those regions want enslaved people to be able to be counted as people when determining the number of representatives that a state would receive. But this then raises the question of, are they people or are they property, right? And the northern states or the larger states are arguing, look, you can't have it both ways, right? They can't be both property and people. You have to make up your mind about that. And so they're essentially saying, if enslaved people are actually property and they're not people, then they shouldn't be counted as people in terms of determining representation. Now, again, all of you I know are familiar with the 3/5 compromise, right? So ultimately what they eventually decide to do is to say, all right, look, we're going to compromise on this. Enslaved people are going to be counted as three-fifths of a person, right? And that is ultimately what will determine representation in government. But what we have to do is consider what the consequences of that decision meant for the institution of slavery and the question of race in the early republic. Because first and foremost, and this is probably an issue you have thought about and considered in your classes, it does mean that enslaved people are not going to be considered full human beings, right? And they certainly do not have the rights, right, of life and liberty that are afforded to other people. But more importantly, and I think this is an issue we tend not to think about as often, it leaves the question of whether enslaved people are people or property largely unresolved, right? So the large states are saying, look, you have to make up your mind. Are they people or are they property? But by creating a compromise, they sidestep that issue. So they never have to fully decide, are they people or are they property? And that becomes a question then that haunts the legal system, the judicial system, and sort of the larger political system of the United States through much of the early republic and into the antebellum era. So for the rest of the time that we have left, which is rapidly dwindling, I want to talk about two remaining issues. How slavery begins to expand in the early republic, and then how the anti-slavery movement and emancipation begins to flourish in the North. So given the fact that there are these very complex and contradictory ideas about slavery coming out of the American Revolution, which should come as no surprise to any of us, that this question about what is the destiny of slavery and the Black population in the early republic going to be, that continues to persist. What it creates then is these sort of rapidly diverging systems, right? The rapid expansion of slavery in the South. And of course, what you notice here, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, is that slavery at this point then becomes largely predicated on cotton cultivation. In previous periods, it was largely focused on tobacco, rice, and to a lesser degree, indigo cultivation, right? But in the early republic, it becomes really largely about the cultivation of cotton. And then in the North, we see very slowly, and the way I have described it here is rather begrudgingly, right? A process of slow and gradual emancipation in the North. And this document here is the front page from the Gradual Emancipation Act that gets passed in Pennsylvania in 1780. And then we have the larger problem of the persistence of racism, even after emancipation happens in the North. This is actually an illustration from an anti-Black race riot and a lynching a whole series of lynchings actually that take place in New York City during the antebellum period. So let's talk first about what's happening in the South. And I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I know this information is familiar to most of you. What happens immediately after the American Revolution, interestingly enough, is that slavery is actually starting to phase out in large portions of the South, particularly in the Chesapeake, in the Virginia and Maryland regions, for a number of really significant reasons. The first, of course, is about what happened during the American Revolution itself. The English, of course, had passed a couple of significant proclamations, Lord Dunmore's proclamation and the Phillipsburg Proclamation, both of which had encouraged enslaved people to run away, right? And to abandon plantations, particularly in the South. So there were an estimated 100,000 people, about a fifth of the enslaved population, flees from bondage during the American Revolution and pretty substantially weakens the economy. Compounding that is the naval blockade that the British had implemented along the coastline, preventing trade, right, from coming in and out of the colonies. So even though the United States wins, right, their independence, their economy is in pretty terrible shape following the revolution, and trying to reconstitute slavery is a bit more of a challenge than is sort of normally presented. The other thing, and I think this is really important, is that natural rights philosophy and the Great Awakening, the influence of those ideas was not only happening in the North, right? It was also proliferating in the Southern colonies. And there are a lot of Southern slaveholders that are grappling with these same questions, right? How do we feel about liberty? How do we feel about the moral challenges of the Great Awakening? And so throughout the colonies, people are grappling with the question about morally, politically, whether they feel like they can allow slavery to continue. Obviously, as we know, slavery not only survived, but it proliferated. And so the question is how and why. Largely up until this point, slavery had been, I'm trying to use my cursor here, I'm hoping you guys can see it, but slavery had largely been centered in the Chesapeake region, what we think of as Maryland and Virginia, and then also into North and South Carolina. So this is where the largest number of people are enslaved in the colonies. But after the American Revolution, slavery starts to expand down into what we think of as the Deep South. Now, that is in part as a result of the victory in the American Revolution, but also a couple of other things that happened during the period of the era of the early Republic. So if you look at the part in this map in red, this is the territory that had constituted the original 13 colonies prior to the American Revolution. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, you see this region in kind of lime that now has become US territory. And of course, this map has kind of tried to superimpose current states over the top of it. So this is when what we now know of as Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, right? These now are becoming US territory. And of course, the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 brings us out to this kind of beige territory. So within the space of about 20, 25 years, the size of the United States triples, right? And that's a pretty significant game changer. This is another image here. So in pink, you see here what now constitutes the United States following the American Revolution. And here in purple, we see what happens as a result of the Louisiana Purchase. So all of this territory down here, in terms of what we now think of as the Deep South, has now become US territory, and it's primed and ready, right, for cultivation. The other significant factors, obviously, are the technological developments that are taking place at the same time. During the early Republic, we see the proliferation of textile inventions. There's, as you can see in this image, all kinds of new machines that make it much more efficient and quick to process raw materials into finished products. So we have really advanced spinning and weaving machines that really dramatically lower the cost of processing cotton and turning it into finished products. What that means is that across the northern United States and England, the demand for cotton is skyrocketing, and we see the establishment of textile mills taking place at incredibly rapid rates. The other issue, and again, I'm going to go through this really quickly because I know this part is familiar to you. We also have the invention of the cotton gin, right? Which is, of course, short for cotton engine. This is an image of the very first cotton gin. For those of you who are in my generation or older, the first cotton gin is probably about the size of a record player. For those of you who are in younger generations, you know, this is probably the size of about a tall 17-inch laptop, right? So the very first cotton gin is pretty small. But as you'll see in these images, cotton gins take off very quickly. Eli Whitney in 1793 is credited for inventing the first cotton gin. There is a historical debate about whether he was the one who really did that. But what's significant about the cotton gin is that it makes separating the cotton ball from the seed and from the pod much more quick and effective. I don't know how many of you are you know, perhaps are originally from Texas or other parts of the South. I often am teaching students in the North who have never seen a cotton plant before, but I imagine many of you are familiar. Cotton is not necessarily easy to extract from the plant. And it often kind of has, you know, residue on it. What the cotton gin does is make it possible to process raw cotton into finished products. So the invention of the cotton gin really seals the South's fate as what eventually becomes known as the Cotton Kingdom. But more significantly for our purposes, it really seals the fate of Black people as enslaved laborers. And if you look over time, the size of the cotton gin changes rapidly and dramatically. And of course, what we also see is that it is enslaved Africans or enslaved Black people, right, who are the laborers who are making that happen. So within a relatively short period of time, during the beginning of the early republic, cotton becomes king in the Deep South, and the Southern economy becomes almost entirely dependent upon enslaved labor. Just to give you a sense of how this scales up so dramatically, here are some statistics. And again, you'll have this PowerPoint to look at later. But if you look at 1820, there are about 300,000 bales of cotton being produced in the South. And by the eve of the Civil War, that has gone up to 4.8 million bales of cotton. To give you a sense of what this means, there's about 500 pounds of cotton in a bale. And so by the eve of the Civil War, the South is producing nearly 2.5 billion pounds of cotton per year. So it happens quickly and it happens dramatically. And even by the year 1800, so even very early on, during the period of the early republic, cotton plantations have already started expanding dramatically across the Deep South. And cotton production is very quickly starting to form the foundation of Southern economy. What that means for our purposes is that beginning in the early republic, slavery triumphs over democracy. And if you look at this particular map, this is the concentration of enslaved people by 1820. So towards the tail end of the early republic. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, you can even see already into Mississippi and Alabama, the enslaved population is already at or reaching 50% of the overall population. And by 1860, there's 4 million enslaved people in the United States. 60% of them are in the Deep South. And of course, you can see again here on the map, the dramatic percentages that are taking place. I know we're starting to run low on time, and I want to make sure we have time to talk. But I do want to just talk quickly about the process of emancipation in the North and some of the challenges that that emancipation faces in the North. The big point that I want you to take away from this section is that slavery had become very deeply entrenched in the North, in much the same way that it did in the South. And I know that's not how we tend to think about the history of the North, but slavery, particularly slave trading, had become central to the Northern economy. And slavery was part of the social, economic, and political life of the North for over 150 years. So emancipation was not as quick and easy of a process as you might imagine. But what happens during the American Revolution is that you have a coalition of advocates of natural rights and religious reformers who had been influenced by the Great Awakening, who begin to effectively pressure Northern state legislatures to pass emancipation acts. The problem, and this is the other sort of key point that I want you to take away from this, is that there was tremendous resistance to emancipation in the North because states had become very heavily dependent upon slavery and slave trading as institutions. So what that means is that slavery in the North gets phased out in pretty different ways according to the region in which it existed and how entrenched slavery had become in that particular territory. So the process of the anti-slavery movement kind of takes place in phases. So the first wave is that you see Northern states starting to ban future slavery, right? So slavery continues to exist where it already was, but they're saying, okay, we're not going to trade in slaves anymore. So no new slaves are going to be coming into the region. And we're also going to make it easier for people to free their slaves, right? But eventually they begin to eliminate slavery outright. What we see in the North is two systems of emancipation. One is immediate abolition, which is exactly what it sounds like. As of a particular date, slavery no longer exists in this state. And gradual emancipation, which is a process whereby slavery gets phased out in a variety of different ways, sometimes according to a person's age, and sometimes according to how long a person had been held in bondage. The point here is that the method, whether it's immediate abolition or gradual emancipation, is largely based on perceived political and economic necessity. It will probably come as no surprise to you that there's only two states that pass immediate abolition acts. Vermont in 1777, and you notice here in their case, it's pretty close following the Declaration of Independence, and Massachusetts in 1783. Now, I always ask my students, why do you imagine those particular states? It comes as no surprise that Vermont would pass an immediate abolition act because there is not today a large Black population in Vermont, and there wasn't in 1777 either. So people in Vermont had very little to lose by passing an immediate abolition act. In Massachusetts, they are really heavily influenced by natural rights philosophy. And if you think about the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Massachusetts is really the center of natural rights philosophy and the ideology of the American Revolution in the North. So people in Massachusetts, as you can see, it takes them a while. It's not until the end of the American Revolution that they finally pass an immediate abolition act, but they are compelled to do so because of the ways in which they're influenced by natural rights philosophy. All of the other Northern states adopt some version of gradual emancipation, which, as you can see here, essentially creates a system of indentured servitude. Each one of these states has little nuances in their laws. But in the big picture, what the vast majority of them are doing is picking a date and saying, as of this date, anyone who is born before this date will live out the rest of their lives in slavery. Anyone who is born after this date will essentially, labor as an indentured servitude, as an indentured servant until they reach a particular age. It's usually somewhere between 25 and 28. And then at that point, they will become legally free. What I want you to notice about these dates is how late a couple of them in particular occur. New York does not pass its Gradual Emancipation Act until 1799. New Jersey, not until 1804. So what that means is that in large portions of the North, and particularly in the parts of the North that have the largest enslaved populations, right? Places like New York and New Jersey, people are still living the bulk of their productive lives under slavery. And in some regions, particularly in New Jersey, you have people who are enslaved almost up until the outbreak of the Civil War. So the North is not as universally of a non-slave holding region as we typically like to think. The other significant component of this is that large numbers of northern states pass compensated abolition laws. And essentially what those laws say is that slaveholders should not be sort of penalized by the abolition of slavery. And so for slaveholders who have to pay for, children, young children, until they're able to work, states actually used governmental funds to compensate slaveholders to help raise children until they were old enough to be able to work for them. What that tells us is that much like the South, even though the North passes anti-slavery laws or emancipation laws, what that tells us is that even in the North, large portions of people are still valuing the right to property more than they are valuing the right to liberty. It is important to point out, as I don't want to make it sound like gradual, I don't support gradual emancipation or that there was something negative about it. It is important to point out that gradual emancipation did break the cycle of slavery, and it did set into motion a situation in which people would not serve as slaves for life, and that slave status would not any longer be passed from mother to child. So that is really important. But I think it's equally important to point out the fact that it emphasizes the fact that most Northerners did not support emancipation, that this is a process where laws are being passed on the legislative level, but it doesn't necessarily change how people on the ground feel. And the images that I circulated for hopefully for us to discuss in the breakout sessions or perhaps as a group are all images that spoof the idea of emancipation. This image here is one that was circulated in New York City around the time of official emancipation. And here you have enslaved people on the left side of your screen being depicted as bears, so reducing them to animals. And then on the right side of the screen, it's enslaved people are being depicted as the devil, holding up a sign saying, "I'm free," right? So even in the North, as these emancipation laws are being passed, the average person on the ground has not changed their minds about how they feel about Black people or how they feel about slavery. And they're certainly not prepared to accept Black people as free and equal citizens. So what that means is that most people in the North, as they are emerging out of bondage, are experiencing what some activists at the time referred to as an unequal freedom, right? A defective freedom, because they are facing, in many cases, poverty, right? They're trying to go into the cities and find jobs. And because of their race, they are not being afforded an opportunity to join in the economy. I'm sorry, by the way, if you're hearing a background noise, they have tornado sirens that go off at this time of the day here in Ohio. So I apologize for that. They are also facing a lack of equality and citizenship. So throughout the North, there is still segregation. There's still discrimination. Black men are not given the right to vote in most Northern states. And so they have this sort of quasi-free status, right? They are not actually given the rights of full citizens. Natural rights are not extended to them in the same way, even after they are given legal emancipation. And of course, the real problem throughout much of the 19th century in the North is what I alluded to earlier, anti-Black racial violence. This is actually an image of an attack on a colored orphanage in New York City. So what we see in pretty much every northern city and town during the 19th century are Black institutions like churches, schools, homes, businesses being attacked by arson, but also beatings and lynchings, just mass violence and race riots taking place in most of these northern cities. So I think we have just hit up, I think I timed this pretty well. We pretty much hit right up upon break time. But the real sort of concluding idea that I want you to take away from this is that, you know, there's the ways in which slavery and race create a fundamental crisis for the ideals of the American Revolution and democracy, right? That on the one hand, we have the ideal of freedom, justice, equality for all. But the reality is that slavery and racism continue to sort of hound American society as the white folks who have just gained their own freedom from England are trying to determine what types of rights they're actually willing to extend to the Black population. So I will, I'll stop there, and I know we'll have plenty of time for discussion.